Hello and welcome everyone to Rumi Forum Luncheons. We're very happy to have with us today once again, Dr. Shireen Hunter. She is a visiting professor at Georgetown University, has written many books and is here to talk to us today about one book in particular, her most recent book, which is Reformist Voices of Islam, Mediating Islam and Modernity. So without further ado, I won't keep you waiting.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure again to come to Rumi Forum. I think that the forum really is beginning to become a very important Washington fixture. No, really, and the list of speakers, I am one of the least prestigious ones. You have to see from government officials to ex-officials and so on. Anyway, at any rate, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for all of you who have taken the time to come and listen to me. The subject of basically religion and modernity is obviously a very controversial one, and it only requires, as a fool, there are only fools who go where the angels fear to tread. And so obviously I am a fool, definitely, to have taken on this. But on the other hand, it's also, I think, that a question that is particularly important in the Muslim world right now, because what we are seeing in a way in many Muslim societies, there is a sort of almost a polarization between those who think that religion in general is not compatible with modernity, and I will say why, and others who think that modernity is not compatible with having faith and having basically religion. And this, of course, is a very difficult thing, because whether we like it or not, the modern has indeed happened. Like in human experiences, like human beings, when I speak and sometimes I let myself go and say something that I shouldn't have said, I can't take that word back. In life also, what we do is happened, is gone into history. No matter how we try to retrieve it, it doesn't. So I think that in some, at least Muslim societies, it seems that perhaps after a period of perhaps a too imitative embrace of at least the outward manifestation of the concept of modern, now we are seeing that seeing some of it perhaps not so very positive effects. There seems to be an effort to recreate in what I call it almost an imagined and idealized past that in many ways has never existed, or if it had existed, we really don't have any proper record of it that has existed, because let's face it, we don't have, for instance, accounts of travelers. We didn't have a Marco Polo who visited Medina in 7th century AD to tell us what was life there or how was governance done there. If we had, at least we would have some glimpse of it, or we didn't have Herodotus to tell us what was going on in various places. The question of, first of all, I think that when we want to discuss the issue of Islam and modernity, we have to understand that we do have definitional problems. What do we mean by modern? Modernization is a totally different thing than concept of modernity. Some people would argue that we haven't, like even people like Habermas and so on, would argue that we have not yet achieved the ideals of modernity. In a way, as he calls it, modernity is still an unfinished project. Others will tell you, like the postmodernists, that actually modernity was not something very positive at all, and it led to the kind of hubris, shall we say, in humans, letting them play God, if you want, that led to many disasters, notably, for example, the world wars and the kind of genocides and whatever, the Holocaust and what have you. So this is the sort of modern gone wild in a way. And so that we have seen in general, let's say that, the reactions to modernity started out quite early, even, in 19th century. But what I mean is, though, that this whole experience of the modern or the effects of has created its own backlash. So first of all, let me just say what I understand by what we mean by modernity and where we can actually locate the advent of the modern or the advent of modernity. Now, admittedly, people used to think that, you know, medieval Europe was just a total wasteland and so on, and then there was nothing going on. Now, obviously, we have revisionists thinking of medieval Europe and so on. Some people would go and say that, you know, already the seeds of the modern began in Renaissance, you know, Italy and whatever. But we have to say that by and large, we can date, you know, basically the modernity. I'm not going to use the word enlightenment, because enlightenment is a very heavily loaded, because it means that others were completely in dark, and that also it assumes that there is only one way of knowing. In other words, through a rational, empirical way. But we know better in part because our own knowledge is so limited of everything, and so there may be different ways of knowing. But basically, what are the foundations of modern thinking? The first aspect of modern thinking is that definitely modern gives a more important place for reason. Rational reasoning, and they think that using human reasoning and also observation, empirical, basically also research and whatever, that is the way to knowledge. That's how we can find out what is going on. So they put, therefore, knowledge acquired through these processes, through the scientific method, if you want, which is based on reasoning. They put this opposed to knowledge which has come through what we call revelation. And so obviously, therefore, if you look at the modern, the process of modern in this basis, it definitely, of course, there is a basic conflict between modern notions and modern way of looking at world, if you want, that with any type of religion. Because religion says that, you know, everything comes from revelation. We know, for instance, about the origins of life and how it was created, the earth and the sky and everything, through revealed books that have told us, you know, how it happened. For example, let's say one of the very controversial issues, not just in Muslim world, actually some of them are, but everywhere, is, for instance, how the world was created. How old is the world? Fossils and geological experimentations tells us the world is perhaps not only millions and millions of years, but perhaps even billions of years. Whereas the scriptures tell us that the world was created in 6 days, basically. Okay, so therefore it is, in a way, there is some sort of, some people would argue that in general there is a conflict between reason and revelation. This is one. So the first point I want to make is that if we look at it in that sense, the idea that somehow it's only Islam which is incompatible with modernity is a fallacy. Any kind of divinely based knowledge, or any knowledge that bases its source, some sort of a divine revelation done through God's messengers, is obviously going to be opposite to a system which says that no, it is human reasoning and human, you know, experimentation and finding that is a basis of knowledge. So this is first thing that we have to understand. But one of the so-called, you know, foundations of definitely modern age is the age of reason. That's why they call it, you know, let's say that mid-18th century and then continuing on that. So this is one aspect. The other thing is that relates really the issues of governance and social order, because this is also very important, and this aspect of the matter is far more at issue in Islamic countries in many ways. And that is that what are the basis of people's life, basically people's rights. Essentially, again, a religious system says that people's rights are the ones that are given by God. which essentially actually are not so much rights, that it is kind of the consequence of duties that God has asked of the human beings to perform. So for example, when it says that in the scripture says that, you know, thou shalt not kill, okay, that means that the other person has a right to life. Or thou shalt not steal. It means that the other person has a right to his property. You cannot wrongfully deprive somebody. But it doesn't say that human beings, by nature of being human, have certain fundamental rights. So this is, again, another basic divide, because this is also where we have, particularly in regard to Muslim world, and particularly in terms of relationship between the Islamic world and the West, we have some of the most critical frictions that we have here. But we see more or less at the same time that we see the dawning of the so-called age of reason, we also have the concept of natural rights that comes being. Now, again, this is not something that only Jean-Jacques Rousseau discovered, but the problem is that in history of humanity, in general, human beings forget a lot more. They were Greek and Roman philosophers that also argued that there are some basic rights that human beings have, and that this is valid everywhere, and that no cultural differences can justify ignoring these rights. But this also was very, very important. So if you have a right to certain things, not because God has given them to you, but because you are a human being, and as a human being you have those rights. So again, we see here that the source of rights suddenly also changes. The source of rights changes from divine into natural, if you want to call it. So this is another. Now, if every human being has a right to certain rights, it means also that they also have the right to decide for themselves in many ways what kind of society they want to have, and what kind of processes through which they want their society to be governed. Here is again, we change from a concept of legitimacy that before was based either the direct right of monarchs and so on, which the so-called divine right of God, divine right of kings, because kings assume that the right to rule over others was given to them by God. Or we have in Islam, and also, you know, in early, I mean, in certain periods of Christianity, that no, the gods don't have that right directly, but it is sort of transmitted to them through some kind of a divine, you know, intervention, whether it was the church in the case of Europe, or in Islam, they are just a vice regent. In other words, they don't have themselves any absolute right to decide what they can do. Their right only is to apply God's commandments, and to create. When you look, for example, Imam Ghazali, when he talks about what is the duty of an Islamic government, the most important duty of Islamic government is to create conditions, not to create welfare, not to create, you know, prosperity or whatever, but to create conditions within which Muslims can practice their religion freely. So this is rights. The other difference between a modern conception of life and world and a religious conception of life and world, which begins with the period of, shall we say, already with the Renaissance, is that a religious worldview, at least it's assumed to be, although historically this hasn't been, in most religious views, including Islam, although Islam is a little bit less so, is that this life basically is ephemeral. This is because of that sin that Adam
committed
and got, and so you see this in, for instance, the poetry of a lot of mystics, Muslim mystics, that essentially that like the Persian poet Hafiz says that considers this world as a cage, And it says, a cage like this is not worthy of me. I was a dweller of the heavens, and Adam brought me to this basically wasteland, and so on. So you see, this is this concept is that, or if you know, the other thing that I remember from my past education, that this world is a vale of tears. In other words, we are here to basically suffer, and if we are good, then we will have everlasting life, and so on. So basically, a religious vision of the life is something that looks for afterlife. This life is just something that you prepare yourself for afterlife. Now, modern concept, of course, not necessarily is, no, life is here, essentially here and here, now and here and now. And so basically what you do is that you make a life better in here. Now, posed this way, both in terms of, therefore, a methodology of understanding and knowledge, both in terms of the sources of rights, and also, therefore, the basis of what is right or wrong. Ultimately, if human beings are the deciders of what is right or wrong, and in a kind of a modern world, then it is only the customs of society that determines what is right or wrong. So, you know, a modern concept of right or wrong becomes very flexible and very elastic, and, you know, and so that. In terms of governance, who have the right to govern and who don't, again, the basis is totally different. It is not just an individual or group of individuals that have certain rights given by God to them. It is the community in general, and through the mechanisms that this will and whatever is expressed. And also, what is the essential object of life? Also, we see that the balance has been turned towards from other world to this world. So, if we take it in this way, then basically, then one could say that every religion in general is against the concept of modern. And it cannot be modern. If you look at, for instance, I don't agree, by the way, I'm going to say what I have to say. If you hear, for instance, Max Weber talking about particular societies which have had difficulty modernizing or have been behind the modernization process, he says that the first requirement of modernization or becoming modern is what he calls the disenchantment of the world. Meaning, by disenchantment, he means that not to believe anything that you cannot actually experience or experiment, which means that revelation or whatever, something that you cannot prove through the, you know, mere kind of experimental reasoning or mathematical reasoning or whatever it is. Reduced to its very essential, it seems to me, the conflict that we talk about between modernity in general and religion is really this age-old conflict between faith and reason. And the notion and idea that somehow faith and reason are in opposition to one another. And of course, the excess of belief in human reasoning, that's what I said, is that it could really go wild. It can go wild. For instance, knowledge is neutral. But people that implement that knowledge can make it good or can make it evil. So what is going to have to determine what is good and what is evil? Why should, you know, people say, okay, why killing millions of people is evil? Why? If it is, everything is relative, somebody may say, if I want to create a certain ideal, I might as well go ahead and kill it. So you have to have, in addition to the fact that this is against the solidarity of the society or whatever, you have to have some kind of, I think, an ethical frame of reference that this is bad. In part, then, this is where the issue of faith comes in, the issue of some sort of a religious balance comes in here. Why killing is bad? Because God says, thou shalt not kill. And it says it for some reason, because if you kill it, I think it is I'm not sure if I don't want to misattribute, but I think it's Christ who said that who shall live by the sword will die by the sword. Because that's what it is. Violence then leads to violence and so on. So what I'm saying is that reason is good, but I think reason alone, because human beings are imperfect, cannot provide the sort of ethical foundation that you want. For example, let's say that let's look at genetic engineering, something that it is very, obviously. In some ways, if we can isolate certain genes and cure diseases and do all these things, obviously this is very good. But what about if we have a mad scientist? Which we have. I mean, Mary Shelley was incredibly prescient when he wrote people look at, the Frankenstein and look at it just a monster story. This is a basic ethical issue. That what is it going to be, this human, particularly hubris, what is it going to balance that? The hubris that we have. Now, the point is that is it really reason and revelation necessarily in conflict with one another? We have had historically a lot of people who have said, no, this is not so. I mean, for example, my examples from Christian part is very, very iffy, because I don't know enough of that. But for instance, a pioneer in reconciling faith and reason was St. Thomas of Aquinas. And Avicenna says himself that nothing that you can find by reason, you cannot find anything that can be repellent to revelation. In other words, and then they say that because not also all human beings have the kind of rational capacity, or basically, let's face it, brain power, that to find out, anything. So we have the same issue also, in Islamic world. So with all this sort of preliminary discussion was to make one point, that it is not Islam per se that it is so anti-modern. Muslim societies have not yet modernized as such, because they started late and so on. But that what we really have talking about between the question of problem of modernization is this age-old conflict of faith and reason. Human beings as total masters versus a human being that needs the disciplining, if you want, to moderate, guiding influence of divine intervention and whatever. So in that sense, Islam and other religions are not really so different. When we see in the Western world what has happened essentially is that basically religion has withdrawn. Essentially, religion from society among people has not been eliminated, but religion as a force as such, challenging the modern notions, has basically retreated, has withdrawn. Whether it is good or bad, I am not talking. In the Islamic world, this still is not the case. Quite the opposite. A lot of people in the Muslim world are still committed to that. Now, is Islam necessarily against the rational way of thinking? My own observation and what I know of Islam is that the answer is no. However, we have had people, schools of Islamic jurisprudence, or what we can call theology, kalam, that have had an approach which makes it far less appropriate to a rational way of thinking. For example, when we come, for instance, to the issue of God's attributes, we have some schools of Islam that they just are very anthropomorphic. For instance, when they talk about God's hand, they literally mean hand. Or when they talk about God's power, they talk about a throne and so on. So when I read those things, to be honest with you, I personally, I shouldn't say this on cameras, a lot of people are going to resist. I hope there's not going to be a fatwa against me. But the fact is that in my opinion, is a sort of almost, don't want to even use the word insult to God, but it is. Because if you look at the Quran, if I may quote this, he says that لم يكن ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. There is nobody like him. How do we know how he looks? But if you have, and again, I know that the word Mu'tazili is very thing, I shouldn't mention it even perhaps, definitely a fatwa is coming, is that, but they say no, when we talk about God's hand, we mean his omnipotence, or we mean, so there is way of how do we translate, scripture. I had a grandmother who was a very religious lady, a saint almost, I could say. The way she was calm, honestly, I have never seen anything like that. If I could have a slightest bit of, in the face of adversity or anything, she had the faith, I could not. But she was also very enlightened. When we discussed this, the whole creation of, for instance, world in 6 days, he says that, what do you know that how long God's day lasted? God's day may have lasted several million years. I mean, so maybe the story of Noah and so on we have, it's just the tail end of a process that had been going on. So it really depends, it seems to me, that how you want to interpret this issues. Now, in the Muslim world, again, many of the other things that we have to understand. In the Islamic world, in terms of areas that problem of modernity really comes into being, I think that most of the Muslims now have no problem with scientific exploration and so forth. This, I think that is, unless you are some very extremists like Taliban and so on, but I think even they are using cell phones. They are all digital. They are using all kinds of things. So this is but yes, they say that, this is from Satan and so on. So if it is from Satan, you are using them sometimes for satanic purposes. But the cell phone is a neutral thing. You can have a cell phone and send comforting messages to somebody, and you can have a cell phone. So it is only human agency that can make things good or evil. Things per se are not good or evil. It is the human agency. I'm just...
Sure, no problem. I just wanted to interject.
Yeah, I just want now to get into the problem in the Muslim world. So I think that for the scientific thing, it is no problem. In some Muslim countries, and believe it or not, in some of them that in America now are seen as the devil incarnate, they have a much more open-minded attitude than some quarters in the West. For instance, in Iran, birth control is freely given. In fact, the Iranian consumption of birth control is more or less up to Western level. 75% of women practice birth control. And this was done, Ayatollah Khamenei himself did that. He said that, do you want to produce so many children that will be hungry, and then you have to go and beg the Western powers for your daily bread? And so this is one thing. Abortion, in certain cases, that has been accepted. There are even fatwas and so on for that. So there are certain areas that these things already have been. What are the areas that, of course, there are some other people that are not, this enlightened. What are some of the areas that it is more thing, and whether this has anything to do with Islam or not? One area obviously relates to the politics, whether you have democratic government or not. Now, modern as such, if we look at modern only in terms of use of reason and science, in my opinion, that is not modernity as, shall we say, the apostles of modernity, had in mind, John Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire and Montesquieu, what have you, all of that. They had a more, also what I call the liberating dimension of modernity, which that giving human beings a degree of subjectivity, to decide for themselves, to be engaged and so on. You can have a very scientifically modern society, but have not to be modern. Soviet Union was not a modern society. People with Nazi Germany was not like that, or Franco's Spain, even though he created, or Pinochet's, whatever, these were not modern societies in the sense that we were the liberating dimension of modernity. So we haven't achieved modernity in that ideal form. But of course, I will also say, however, that there is a basic dialectics and contradiction in the whole reason as well. Because one of the problems I have with excessively rationalist people who do not want anything, give any credit that revelation may have a role, and that there are other ways of knowing, you know, what Rumi calls the eye of the heart. The eye of the heart. Is that they don't want to subject their own axioms to rational examination. For instance, one of the examples I use with my students, I say that, okay, you may have problems and I may have problems. In fact, the fact that all the animals were just only the ones that was in Noah's Ark or whatever. But I say I also have problem with the theory of Big Bang. How you are going to prove to me that Big Bang did this? And if you're asking me if God created everything, who created God? Well, I can say that if Big Bang caused all this thing, then who caused the Big Bang? They get angry. Scientists get angry. They don't. So they are not really modern. Why? Because they don't push the logic of reasoning to apply to their own reasoning. However, getting back to the Islamic context, areas that definitely, obviously, Islamic practice is behind any notions of modern. And I will submit that this is against the true nature of Islam and what the Prophet intended. And I'm not just being, you know, this is not sophistry. I truly believe in that. One area of that has to do with the penal code. The idea that in this day and age you can cut anybody's hand or whatever, it is different. In the book and in some other things that I have published, many religious leaders, and again here Iran is very important because they had the Islamic revolution, the experience with an Islamic government, they have seen certain things, so you have most of the modernist thinking, like in other religions as well, is coming from within the clergy themselves, and they are, for example, but there are some other scholars are also saying, he says in the Quran when it says qata, which means to cut, but qat also means can be interrupt. So when it says you have to cut the hand of thief, you can interpret mean not that you physically, this is very unjust. A God that is Adil and Rahim and Rahman, you know, somebody is just hungry and one thing, and you just cut the hand, the Taliban justice or whatever. This to me is not the God, because this is not the God that I believe in, you know. So what it means, qata, which means maybe also interrupt. When said the program was qata, why? Which means interrupted. Like our program right now, we may have an electric fault and the program may be, okay. So what it means to interrupt, how can you interrupt? You can put him in detention, you can put, so you see what I'm trying to say. So what I'm saying, this is one area. But what Muslim world has to do this? Muslim world needs to start talking about these things. Problem with the Islamic world now we have a proliferation of people who claim to be religious savants or religious scholars. And they haven't even, you know, in the old days when I was a girl, donkeys years ago, it would take people 25, 30 years before they became an alim. To become an everyday now, at a drop of a hat, you have a mufti. I mean, this thing takes time. You can't just, to learn even proper Arabic, not just speak, but understand and interpret. So this is one problem. So what we need is really examining of this text. What did the Prophet actually mean? Did he himself cut any hands? I haven't heard any evidence that he did. I don't know. Maybe there was. I don't know. This is one area. Penal code has to change. The other thing that it is very important, which again I believe it has, there are some ayahs in Quran that are ambiguous, there are some things that are attributed to Prophet Muhammad, which I really don't think he would have said that, because the evidence of how he treated his woman points to other words, is the question of woman. I have always said that I don't know why human society is obsessed with female attire. In the West, I'm sorry to say, women are anxious to see how much they can reveal without, how much they can get away by revealing too much, which is again, you know, something that It's a degree of, cars are advertised with female. Why, a model has to be in bikini with the car, I don't know. But that's how they do it. In the Islamic world, they are obsessed in a different way. That we have to hide this woman. This is fitna. I mean, this also not only is an insult to women, it's an insult, frankly, to men. Because, I mean, what fitna can a woman cause? If a man is reasonably in control of himself and his urges and whatever. So you see, so the question of woman has to be handled properly. The question arises that does it really come from Islam? Or is it that something that a society has really, it was a traditional society and basically societies were patriarchal? There are elements, I mean, in the Quran and so forth, there are at least things that actually shows a more egalitarian approach to women. For instance, in Islam, God says that women and men were created of the same essence. And this is where in the ancient Greeks thought that women don't have souls, because we idealize Athens, that is the thing. But in ancient Greece, women didn't have souls. Women in Islam have all the same duties in terms of religion and so on as men. So I would imagine that justice, because justice is one of the qualifications of God, justice therefore requires, and God is not a capricious God. Muslim God is not a capricious God. It's not a Zeus, or it's not a Jupiter, or Zeus and Jupiter are the same, it's just different. But it's not a Zeus, it's not some Greek god or Roman god or whatever. It's not a capricious God. So justice means if a woman has all the same duties, well then it must also have the same rights and the same rewards. Why is then the men will go to heaven and women, maybe, maybe not, and hang around there somewhere? So I think that these are, again, another things that we have to see. Do we have in Islam the tools to achieve this understanding? I would say yes. And the book that we have are saying how we can do that. In Islam, I will wrap up it. In Islam, we do have what we call process of ijtihad. More importantly, there is an Islamic tradition, something called sabab al-nuzul or asbab al-nuzul or sha'n al-nuzul, depending where you come from. What it means is that the number of Quranic verses were for specific cases, specific conditions, which means, therefore, that logic requires, therefore, that if those conditions do not prevail, then that rule does not apply. You can also use a Roman law principle that says rebus sic stantibus. In other words, even a contract can become null and void if the conditions that had led to that contract become so. So one of the things that we have, whether it is a question of apostasy, or irtad, and whether it is all the other things, it really depends on how you really, interpret this. What is right now the problem in Islamic world, the resistance for certain things, and why is that we see a degree of, how shall I say, retreat within a more literalist interpretation of religion? To begin with, the way modernity was introduced to the Islamic world. Modernity came to Muslim world as a result of imperial expansion of the West. And so it was seen very much as a foreign. The other thing is that, in Europe, also there was resistance to modernity. Even now there is some, resistance. But in Europe, this was an organic process. It took a long time. In the Islamic world, this came with the coming of European, basically, armies and so on and so forth. So there is a certain view of modernity as something foreign, something that is against our own traditions.
Well, and again, this is our way, and our way is right, and your way is wrong.
No, it is. It's
the
just
modernity that came
yes, but no, because
the
way it happened was that, as they say, there is nothing succeeds like success. Mm-hmm. Muslims basically, with the encounter with European expansion and imperialism, let's call it what it was, is that they lost their self-confidence. And a lot of them then became too, in my opinion, imitative. They became, as Khatami said, shifte. Shifte means infatuated. It's not liking something in a reasonable way after reasoning, but infatuation. You don't see it. And this created a lot of, cleavages and so on inside the Islamic countries and so on. The other thing is that in Islamic world initially, because I think that you have to understand, the Muslim world became more acquainted with notions of modernity as developed in France, which had a very strong, I would say, secularist in a sense of anti-religion thing, because the French Revolution, it wasn't just a question of reason, but it was really against God. It was an atheistic thing. I mean, the revolutionaries crowned the reason as in, and look at the blasphemous act. They did it in Notre Dame de Paris, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris, the symbol of Paris's, Christian spiritual essence. So that for a lot of people, modernity has come to be seen with atheism, secularism. Secularism defined as atheism, not a different way of running society and so forth. Whereas if you look at it, the English modernity was not a militant anti-religion. I mean, Queen of England is the head of Church of England. And in Scotland, he is head of Church of Scotland. So in England, she's Church of England, and in Scotland, she's Presbyterian. I suppose, yeah, Presbyterian. So the point I'm trying to say is that it's also this element that, or in America, of course, separation of church and state is a different thing than, being anti-religious and militantly anti-religious, and almost some cases depriving religious people from, their life. So what is the road for Muslims have to do? The only way, it seems to me, Muslims can come to terms with modernity is what I call, and I'm not saying it, I coined the phrase, actually a lot of intellectuals in Iran and others have said, what they call it to nativize modernity. Nativization of modernity in Islamic concept is that to have an Islamic interpretation of modernity, one that is not excessively militantly secular, and one that doesn't appear that it is just accepting wholesale Western things. For example, I think with the proper interpretation, and again I published on this, with the proper interpretation of Islamic principles, you can come with an Islamic definition of human rights, which I would say that 99.9% will be compatible with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, on some of the key issues, for example, on the question of freedom of conscience. Well, what else? How else can Prophet Muhammad says that when he says there is no compulsion in faith, we have shown you the right way and you can choose it. So this is the most boldest thing and so on. Or when it comes even in international relations and so on, people who say Islam doesn't recognize borders. Prophet says we have created you into tribes and people so that you can get to know one another. Well, when Prophet was talking at the time, there was no nation state. So if you want to judge Islamic principles with the 21st century concept of governance, international system, morality and whatever, yes, you're going to have a lot of discrepancies, but then any kind of religion as such time is going to be. So my bottom line is that first of all, there is a conflict between modernity, which is a purely material, and this world alone, reasoning, no place for faith or for religious and revelation and whatever. In this way, modernity is incompatible with all religions. It is a religion in itself. I mean, the French republicanism. I will tell you one story and then I'll shut up, because like this I can go on forever, and you don't want that. Nicolas Sarkozy, now of course he has shut up on this, but he did an interview a long time ago, before he became a president, in Express, which in that he was actually criticizing the excessive secularism of France, or rather I should say the militant secularism of France. And he said, when I went to the funeral recently of a friend of mine, and he said that I was really very pained, I was very sad and so on. He said, try as I may, I couldn't find any comfort in our Republican values, nos valeurs républicaines, that the citizenship of France and Marseillaise and so on. I couldn't find any comfort in this with the loss of this friend. So, so what I'm trying to get at is that human beings need something beyond cold reason. So what you need is, in my opinion, I personally believe in that. Religion without reason degenerates into either superstition and can become a tool of oppression in the wrong hands. But in my opinion, reason not tempered with faith can lead to cruelty, can lead to all kinds of human hubris that can wreak havoc. I mean, let's face it, look what we have done to the world ecologically. This is where the idea of progress gone amok. If we say, as Quran says, that we are vice regents of God on this earth, we are supposed to protect earth for God, not to destroy it. So, personally, I believe that faith and reason in general can be reconciled, and that a basically, in my opinion, balanced human life requires both. Does Islam allow for this? I would be as bold as to say that if properly understood, Islam is even more than others allows for this. So whether Muslims are going to be able to achieve this, all I can say, I hope so.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Because I think really
yes.
we covered it all. I think yes. Okay. Umid, can you handle? Thank you. Is it green? Is the light green?
It's green. Working?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is Sardar Doğan. I have a question. I'm curious why, when we talk about the issue of modernity and religion, why religion has to seek a reconciliation with modernity, but not modernity with religion? And why do we have to associate or identify the word civilized, I would say, with modernity or modernism? Why does it have to be? Or why is religion given an inferior role in comparison to modernity?
No,
and it's especially in the case of Islam, because whenever someone draws example from the Islamic world, every time negative examples are brought into attention, but not the positive ones. It's like Osama bin Laden. Every time is given the greater role or the best role of being every time
right
in the scene, but not as Sufi master maybe, who withdrew himself completely from life and who doesn't exploit, forget the people's right, but even not the right of an end.
Right,
so
right. No, I think I can answer. I will go from your last question to the first question. The last question is partly because good news is no news. Have you ever seen, if you listen to the news about America, I remember once Andy Rooney, whom I liked, I think he's still alive, or I think he died. But anyway, he always used to say, one day he said that, in his news, he said that I want to tell you that something like 90% of Americans have never been in a jail. 85% of American high school students actually graduate, or 65% of school they go to college, and so on and so forth. But this is not news. So if you even look at the, let's say, that evening news, nobody says that such and such, I mean, unless it's, a 2-year-old that can spell is a spelling bee. But otherwise, they would always hear that there was a robbery on East End, somebody killed the other one. So this is partly in the nature of news, unfortunately. That bad news is worthy, unfortunately. You see, this is it. I don't believe, frankly, that. And the other thing is, of course, Osama bin Laden does very spectacular things. And if nobody would have learned about Osama bin Laden if he hadn't had 9/11. So we have to also be a bit because Muslims we have some gripes against how media portrays, but on the other hand we have also to ask ourselves, if we didn't produce an Osama bin Laden, nobody would mention him. The other thing is, of course, a Sufi doesn't want to be mentioned because he has chosen the life of withdrawal and so forth, and only social activists become so I don't think there is a we tend to be a bit, I mean, there are real reasons for it, but sometimes we tend to be a little bit too thin-skinned. We always see, we've become too touchy. We see in everything some kind of a kind of a hidden master plan. Some of it is just the way things, work. On the question of why religion has to adapt itself to modernity, I never said that. I never said that. But the question is, this is the reason of that. For example, Muslim countries say, why are we behind, scientific and other advancement? A lot of it in the old days had to do with the fact the way religion evolved, that certain things, where I remember that reading that, for instance, when first a camera was brought to Iran, I can use only examples of places I know best, one of the ulama said that, devil is looking at you through the camera. I mean, I'm not trying to say this is good or bad, but the point is, now they are all digitalized. You just look at the pictures from Qomna. My God, they have computers, they have hadith on computer, they speak foreign languages left and right. So, but this is, so the point I'm trying to say is that this dichotomy has to be broken. But there are certain practices that frankly is unfair. For instance, the idea that a woman should die at childbirth because there's no female doctor, this is unjust, this is un-Islamic. Ayatollah Motahari gave a fatwa in 1960 that even if the best doctor has to attend that woman, or the idea that a woman should be killed because he talked to a man, this is unjust. Reason here goes into thing. If you understand that God is not a capricious God, it's not, I mean, why don't we then go and sacrifice virgins like they used to do in old Babylon and so on? So if you look at the evolution of religions, it shows that how man using his reason has managed. Before we were frightened of thunder and lightning, we thought that it is God, Thor, or whoever was doing that, so we had to go and sacrifice and sacrifice and sacrifice. Then by using reason and scientific method, we discovered that no, this is not God doing this, this is just some natural phenomena. This is what Max Weber calls the disenchantment of it. What the role of religion and God is to provide the higher ethics that is required to tame if you look at it, human beings are a mixture of good and evil. Good and evil, unfortunately, inhabits the human beings. And so the role of religion and ethics is to keep the evil in check and to provide with that. But nobody is comparing and saying that modernity has to accommodate itself to religion. Well, if we had, then you can go to the whole Greek gods and the myth of Prometheus. We can blame everything on Prometheus because fire is an example for learning, or the tree of knowledge. If you eat from the tree of knowledge, you are damned, or ignorance is bliss. So then, therefore, that we would be still in, so that's one reason, in my opinion.
Okay. Pass the microphone. There's one thing I need to mention.
Maybe we can pursue that outside.
No. It's my question was not about you. I did not blame you. I should say this.
I know you didn't.
It's not that you defend modernity or religion, but why is the reason that the question posed in this way? So I did not blame you.
Because this is part of the human experience. Because if you look at every period of human life, there has been this kind of friction.
Yes, please.
You see what I'm saying? Yes.
Hi, Ermal Hiday, IMF. I wanted to take to start from his question.
Right.
It's going to be one of the very few occasions that Serdar and I actually agree. But I would say that in this case, actually, good news are news, because for more than 100 years now, there have been, I would say 150, and people that know history better than me can validate me on that. But for a very long time in the Muslim world, there have been a lot of very interesting interpretations. So as long as 100 years ago, you have Said Nursi in Turkey that says, for example, that a dynasty is un-Islamic. Again, in the early 20th century, you have Ali Abdel Razak in Egypt that says that.
Of course, he was declared murtad, you know.
Yes, of course, but Said Nursi wasn't. But that says that the caliphate is not necessary for the Muslims. Mm. So, in a time where Islam is under the loop in a negative way, maybe emphasizing the positive, not the positive, emphasizing the interesting interpretations that are compatible with modernity or postmodernity.
Well, that's what the book is doing.
Okay. So, so in that sense, emphasizing that and actually saying that these interpretations have been part of the Muslim understanding of the world for the past 150 years. Absolutely. There might have not been the mode or the medium, but they have been there. I would say that's more important than saying, you know, we have this kind of problem and this is the kind of interpretation, or maybe I misunderstood.
No, you're right. No, well, that is what the book is doing. That's what the book is doing. But the fact also is that if you are an academic and rational person, you have also to look at the evidence. The problem is that these people in the Muslim world have been marginalized. Abdul Razak, yes, I'm sorry, but this, but Said Nursi, in some cases, Said Nursi is a very strict person. I know that Nurju ladies in 1992 when I saw them, they wouldn't even show their hands. And Prophet says you can at least show their hands. It was frightening with Nurju ladies, I'm sorry, but they were frightening. Said Nursi is not for me, I know I shouldn't say this in Rumi Forum, but Said Nursi for me is not the epitome of Islamic modernism. I'm so sorry to say this. Or in Kazan, when I saw some of the Nurjus that were, no, I'm sorry, I have to say this, and maybe I can't go to Turkey or whatever, but that's all right.
Shireen, you're always welcome.
No, but I don't care. At this point in my life, you know, age is very liberating because, you know, I don't have that much more time, and so when you get old, but let me finish. Afghani is far more important than even Abdul Razak and so on because he said these things far earlier. But the point is that unfortunately these people have always been either considered murtad or kafir, and it is happening inside Muslim world. This is what I'm trying to get at. It's not just we shouldn't be defensive about this. These are the things that, you know, for instance, what is the name of the guy? Abu Zaid is Murtad, is living in Netherlands. And Naim is living here, he is Murtad. All the others that have said anything are Murtad. And even Qaradawi, left and right, is declaring people. And of course, the Wahhabis declaring everybody kafir. Everybody is kafir, you know. Now, in this book, we are actually tracing those Muslims who have said, Fazlur Rahman, he was booted out of Pakistan. Jamaat Islami and booted him out of Islam. I don't create these people, Ma'adudi and people like that, they are there, you know, this is evidence. And so, unfortunately, you know, Muslims should not be defensive. There is a lot of wealth of you said the reason 150 years. No, the first era of reason was the Mu'tazili. And what happened to the Mu'tazilis? During the so-called, well, they called it Mehna, but afterwards they were all killed. And so now if anybody says, the worst thing, they can declare you apostate if somebody says he has Mu'tazili tendencies. But they were the first rationalists of Islam. And that's what happened. Imam Hanbali won. Shafi'i said the gate of ijtihad is finished. Tamam, everything we have had to do is done. So you have to have, we say all of this in here, but we also talk about those who have been open-minded and to be honest, the most creative thinking now is coming from Iran. Partly because the Shia is always, the gate of ijtihad in Shiism was open. Secondly, the Mu'tazilis, most of them were Iranians anyway. Even Basri was not, lived in Basra was not, and the fact is that they survived under the Buyid and so on, but no, but this is true. Avicenna is, no, but the Avicenna is considered kafir. He has a poem himself. It says that, or the Al-Ahya Din Imam Ghazali talked about the philosopher. Philosophers are bad. I don't create Imam Ghazali. I am trying to put a positive thing, but ulama always were against this type. Most ulama were against this kind of reasoning, you know. So we have to, but in my opinion, Quran as a body is very much, and if you use the proper thing, is very much flexible to interpretation. But also, why should religion to some degree apply itself to, I mean, for example, is it really right the way the women are treated in, is this, it doesn't have to be, you know, I cannot as a woman become a religious woman if religion, my religion says that you have to be treated like that. I say, okay, if I'm going to live in hell here, I might as well live in hell after I'm died. At least here I can have a reasonable life, and then I go hell and burn in hell. So this is the way I see the God of Islam. I don't see him as Qahhar and Jabbar, and you know, I see him as Kareem and Rahim and Rahman and reasonable. He's not how can he say you have freedom of choice? And then, of course, you know, I will do whatever I want to do. You cannot. So you see, I have a much better, I have a more respect for my God. And I don't believe my God will ever do something that it is unjust. The other thing is the question of mercy. For instance, we talk about qisas. You know, that you have to take one eye for one eye, or whatever. This came all from Old Testament. But in Islam, it says you have the forgiveness is better. So forgive, get some money or something else. Don't insist on qisas. You see, so what is the Prophet was trying to limit the excesses of the society of that time. Do we, in this day and age, we go to say we have to have qisas, and some young man, for instance, did something wrong and now we have to take his eye or insist on that, or a woman's life is half of life of a man. Can you really think that your mother's life is not worth even half of your father's? She gave you life. So all I'm saying is that this is where reason comes into being. You see, this is, and so many things are done under the name of God for the satisfaction of human cruelty and human passion. As I say, why did never in ancient religions ever a young boy got sacrificed in a temple? It was always virgins that were sacrificed in temple of Baal, in temple of whatever in Babylon and whatnot. Why? So you see, why? I mean, slavery, is it good? We shouldn't need to have slavery as well. Whereas Prophet had said you can have slaves, but the best thing is to free them, not to have them. So this is what I'm talking about. The spirit of Islam is very much capable of doing this. I'm not saying, you know, don't misunderstand me. That's why I said that I do not believe, I believe human beings need ethical limits to keep them. I don't believe in self-indulgence individualism, to be honest with you. And I think that in some cases, certain countries have gone too far, and that self-indulgence, you know, not everything that feels good is, how can it be bad as if it feels good, as the song said? Well, it does. If you overdrink, you get cirrhosis of liver. If you use drugs, you blow your brains on this. If you live a very loose life, you end up with AIDS. If you do this, you end up with all this other. So there is, even in nature, excess has its thing. So don't misunderstand me. We also misinterpret what modernity is. Some people have interpreted now being modern is being immoral and loose and not having any limits and living a hedonistic life. But that's not the case. That's not the case. This young lady has one thing.
Last question, please.
Okay. It's a privilege to ask the last question. Yeah. I'm a Fulbright scholar from Turkey. My question is related to women's rights in Islam and how we could reconcile these with the current situation we have ongoing. And for instance, 2 years ago, I remember reading an article on New York Times about a female Muslim scholar who reinterpreted a verse regarding the divorce in Quran. And for instance, we had a woman praying side by side with men in Turkey,
of course,
kind of a prominent woman, and this became a big deal. And you know, I mean, such things happen, and even in our mosques, we still have a separate, small and set aside room for women. And as
that is because they are fit now.
Yeah, and I think, as you said,
if they are there, men cannot concentrate on God.
I think this really puts women, you know, this might create some distance between women and our religion.
Of course.
And my question is, how do we get things going favorable to Muslim women in this still very much male dominant
Sure. Well, part of it, I think that some of these things comes from, frankly, from the transformation of society. For instance, as far as, let's say, that hijab, which is the most outward concept. Well, in Book of Matthew also says women should dress modestly and cover their hair. So all this in ancient Rome, you know, patrician women were covered, but that was, you know, and so on. So some of these things comes from the result of the transformation of society. Secondly, I am a firm believer that part of this thing is that the Islamic law is not properly interpreted. For example, on the question of stoning, rajm, for adultery. In Islam, the rule of a witness is so strict that nobody can be, because it says 4 just witnesses to begin with. The definition of just witness, I remember when I was at Faculty of Law in Iran, I had a professor who was a clergy, because we studied fiqh. And he would say that today, he said, in the entire Islamic world, there is not 4 just Muslims. He was right, because not only you have so the point is, Prophet Muhammad, stoning used to be done. Haven't you seen any of the Cecil B. DeMille movies where they used to stone everybody? In the Romans used to stone women. Everybody used to stone women. This was a sort of thing. But Prophet tried to limit it. He said, unless four just witnesses have seen the couple in flagrante delicta. Yeah, this is not possible, and even says, because as I said, my grandmother was herself was a little mujtahida. She would explain to me how this has to be. So this one, if you apply the Islamic things. Secondly, one of the problems is in Islam is that some people use part of it and the other. For instance, there is this ayah Quran. It says, "Kulu washrabu wala tusrafu." Eat, drink, but do not waste. I remember our classmates used to tease and said that, okay, you just do the kolu washrabu and forget about wala tusrafu. So in this says, for example, in polygamy, it says you can have up to 4 wives. Before it was unlimited, provided you can maintain justice among them. And it is pretty explicit what justice means. Otherwise, limit yourself only to 1. No man can have either the money or the whatever to be able to maintain justice among 4 women. Secondly, if you have a 60-year-old woman and then you marry a 25-year-old, how just you're going to be able? Are you going to visit the 60-year-old as often as the 15-year-old? Of course not. So basically, so there are ways that you do that. In Iran now, for instance, actually Azam Talaqani, who is the daughter of Ayatollah Talaqani, she has been going on and on now on the interpretation what the term rajul or rajal means in the Quran. And this is where linguistics comes into play. Now, there is strong evidence that rajul does not only mean male, it means prominent people, qualified prominent people. So she is running for presidency to prove this, and now in Iran this is no problem. And even the Muslim Brotherhood now has no problem with many aspects of it. They still are not willing to have a woman head of state. But this has to do with the more patriarchal society, the lack of enough education on the part of women. And of course, lately the women themselves have become, because of some of the things that our friend was saying, because of political problems in the Islamic world and so on, this religious conservatism has become a defensive mechanism and has become a way of kind of, asserting your identity, which I can understand that, but I don't think that in the long run it is for the sake of good for Muslims themselves. You know, because I mean, there are certain things. I mean, for instance, you know, you cannot have you know, rational thinking if you don't really subject this stuff. I mean, is it really a woman, you know, let's say that if you want your daughter and whatever, your wife, to be, what do we say, afif or whatever, which I think is a good thing, virtuous. But does really covering yourself is going to make you virtuous? And if you want to do mischief, you cannot do it with, if you have wearing a huge chador, probably you can do it easier. No, really, I'm just saying is that you can do that. So these are certain things that are inside you. You either are or you're not. And this is why, for instance, Ayatollah Kadivar, I discuss in here, he argues, he says, in general, Islam is a religion by persuasion, not by coercion. And he says, applying these things through coercion, he says it creates nifaq, hypocrisy. And hypocrisy is worth. He says there's a difference between religiosity and iman. Iman is inside you. You may go through all the motions and deep down not to believe. People go through the motions, but deep down don't believe. So iman is something, faith is different than, and because you might go to church because that's where all your friends go, you know, the social thing, or you go to mosque because you can make business. I want to see Haji this and have a deal with that, and you know, but the question is, you know, this is iman, faith, and that's why you have to be persuaded, not coerced. And that is what it is. And I think, frankly, if seen in that light, Islam is, and also the other thing about Islam is it's a balanced religion. It is not too otherworldly. You know, like you see, that's why that asceticism in Islam is not good. Excessive asceticism, I mean, like the faqirs in India and so on, starving yourself, and this is not good. Again, my grandmother used to say, and I think it is true, she used to say, Prophet has said, well, she had so many hadiths, particularly from Abu Huraira and so on, that she would say that the Prophet had said that live your life as if you are going to live forever, and live your life as if you are going to die tomorrow. Certain other thing, for example, the difference between charity. People who go to Hajj, most of them actually don't know, but they're committing a sin. Why? You can only go to Hajj after you have taken care of all the needs of your family, extended family, and your neighbors. That there are no needy people in your neighborhood. Otherwise, you should spend the money that you are spending for Hajj on taking care of those. So this is a much more compassionate religion. And the question is that how do you interpret this compassionate religion? So this is my reading of it anyway. Okay.
All right, with that, I thank you. And as a newer follower myself, I highly recommend this book. And I hope you do come to Turkey, maybe with me someday. So thank you very much. You can purchase this book. Actually, there are a few copies outside for $20.
And then there are some flyers. If you don't want to buy now, you can always order from the publisher or whatever, or you just can ignore it. But if you want to hear some good arguments why Islam and modernity can be reconciled and what is required, not by me only, you know, and I am mostly a reporter and interpreter. I mean, these are views of Reformist Voices of Islam, people who are saying this, and all those people are that you mentioned are referenced. Yes, sir.
So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Reform Luncheons. Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure.